Hi, friends. Father Kerry Walters here, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church, and this is another Holy Spirit moment, this one on Stoicism and Christianity. Today is the 1900th anniversary of the birth of Marcus Aurelius. He was born on this day, the 26th of April, in AD 121. Now, Marcus was one of the five so-called good Roman emperors, but more to the point for our purposes today, he was a man who was highly influenced by Stoic philosophy. And as the emperor of the greatest nation of his day, he sought to rule in accordance with Stoic values and Stoic virtues. So it seems to me that it's entirely appropriate to speak about Stoicism today in relationship to Christianity. For about 5 centuries, Stoicism was the going philosophy in Greece and Rome. It was seen as a kind of replacement for religions that had begun to lose their popularity and their sway, and it was also a way of thinking that sought to bring some kind of orderliness to a period that had become increasingly chaotic from a political and economic perspective. It doesn't strike me as unusual that Stoicism, this ancient way of looking at the world, is making a comeback in the West today in the 21st century, and particularly in the United States, because traditional religious worldviews, Christianity in particular, are beginning to lose popularity, and this vacuum that is left in their withdrawal demands to be filled, because human beings are creatures who crave some kind of transcendent meaning. Just as in the ancient world, Stoicism helped to fill that gap, so it seems that it's now filling the gap here in our own country, in our own time. Stoicism is an interesting way of looking at the world. It can be best understood if we see that it was a physics, it was a logic, and it was an ethics. Now, the ethics is primarily what's remembered today when people think of Stoicism, but it's important to say at least a few words about the physics and the logic underlying Stoic philosophy, because it's upon that foundation that the ethics is built. First, the physics. The Stoics seem to think of reality in terms of a giant organism, and this organism is animated by a substance or by a principle that they variously called fire or Zeus or the world mind or simply logos. And this giant organism, which the universe is absolutely determined. Everything that occurs in the universe and in our lives has to be, because of the deterministic nature of the whole. But the good news, according to Stoic way of looking at the world, is that even though everything is determined, it has been determined for the very best. So there is a kind of benevolence that runs through the universe, that runs through the world. Periodically, this universe will collapse and a new one will take its place. But because the structure of reality is inherently deterministic, the new universe that takes the place of the old universe will be exactly in every detail like the old universe. And so it will continue ad infinitum. That's the physics underlying Stoicism. It's not clear that Stoicism is a pure materialism, like its rival philosophy, Epicureanism, was, but it certainly is a deterministic physics. What about logic? You might recall that I said that this world organism is animated by fire or Zeus or world mind, or, and here's the important word, logos. For the Stoic, the entire apparatus of reality is rational, it's reasonable, it can be understood, and it is animated by a principle of orderliness, which we can call the logos. Moreover, we human beings participate in logos, and so we too are rational, and that's what enables us to understand the reality in which we live. the more our individual logoi match up with the universal logos, the more in harmony with nature you and I live. And that brings us to Stoical ethics. According to the Stoics, and this is what they're most famous for, isn't it? What we need to do is to discipline ourselves to live in harmony with nature. There's almost a Taoistic understanding of how to live a good life. If we somehow conform to the rhythm of the determined universe, then our lives are going to be more fulfilled and more enriched than they would if we bucked the system, if we violated what the Asians would call the Tao, and what, of course, the Stoics call the Logos. And what that means, my friends, is that for the Stoic, we must simply accept what comes to us. We must recognize that there are some things within our limited control, but there are most things which are not. And so what we need to do is to recognize that difference and to cultivate a kind of indifference to the things over which we have no control. What we need to do is to live in such a way as to create within us apatheia, indifference. It's not a passivity, it's not a listlessness, so don't confuse apatheia with our English word apathy. Instead, it is a discriminating awareness that I am not in control of most of the things in my life. And so what I ought to do is to let go of the urge to try and dominate them, to try and control them. And moreover, I ought to let go of attachment to the things of the world, which will ultimately pass away out of my grasp, including the people whom I love. So detachment is a key word in Stoic ethics. Learning to live within the contours of nature is another principle that we find in Stoic ethics. Now, the heyday, as I mentioned earlier, of Stoicism was about 5 centuries, and those 5 centuries included the earliest centuries of the Christian church. And it is incredible how influential Stoicism was upon at least some of the church fathers, especially St. Ambrose, who was such an influence on St. Augustine. And it's not hard to see why. Even though the physics doesn't conform to the Christian worldview, the notion of logos certainly does. After all, John, in the prologue to his gospel, speaks about the incarnate word, which is the logos. Moreover, the ethics of detachment, of equilibrium, of recognizing what's in our control and what isn't in our control, is compatible with a great deal of Christian ethical thinking. Erasmus, the great Christian humanist who lived during the Reformation, is said to have once declared that he gets his spiritual truth from the Bible, but his ethical wisdom from Cicero. The point being that Cicero was at least an on-again, off-again Stoic. He seems to have been more of a skeptic than a Stoic, but let's grant Erasmus his particular reading of Cicero. So there seems to be, at least in part, some compatibility between Stoicism and Christianity. But there is more incompatibility than compatibilism, and I just want to very briefly suggest why. In the first place, the Christian worldview is not one that has the entire universe determined. There is free will in the Christian worldview. Otherwise, if there is not free will, then there is no reason to believe that any kind of action conforms to either praiseworthy or condemn-worthy declarations. In order to be moral creatures, human beings have to be free. Even the Stoics recognize that. And so for the entire history of Stoicism, there was this tension between the deterministic physics that Stoics embraced and the need to somehow make a bit of human freedom, at any rate, compatible with that overall determinism. And the general way in which the Stoics, unsuccessfully in my view, tried to resolve that tension was to say that we're free in here. We are free to desire or not to desire. We are free to choose or not to choose what's given to us in the deterministic universe. But of course, if the universe truly is determined, then we are also determined to desire what we desire and to choose what we choose. In the Christian worldview, however, freedom, free choice, the ability to make a choice, to make a decision is essential. Moreover, even though the Stoics sometimes use the language of divinity when they refer to the world mind or the logos as Zeus, there really is no concept of a personal God in Stoicism. There is an abstract pantheism. The world organism, the universal organism, seems to have this fire, this logos, immanent within it, and yet it is a very abstract sort of metaphysical principle which no sane person would think about appealing to or praying to. Moreover, there's a curious self-reliance that Stoicism preaches. Even though it seems to be incompatible with the deterministic worldview that Stoicism also proclaims. Stoicism argues that you and I, to one extent or another, are capable of liberating ourselves from attachments to the world. We are capable of becoming utterly self-reliant if we simply tame our desires, if we tame our passions, if we recognize what's in our control and what's not in our control. But the thing about that is that most of the Stoics that you read, and particularly Marcus Aurelius, don't seem to be all that self-sufficient, all that self-reliant. I love Marcus Aurelius. I think that reading him is one of the great enriching pleasures of the Western canon. But it cannot be denied that in the book that he wrote, a book that's frequently entitled Meditations in English translation, he often appears to be almost pathetically uncertain of himself, almost pitiably unself-reliant. He's constantly having to urge himself to not fear death, for example, or to act virtuously, or to not give way to his passions. There seems to be very little self-control on Marcus Aurelius's part. Otherwise, why would he keep urging himself to greater and greater and greater self-control? That's the first point that I would like to make here with the self-reliant nature of Stoicism, that it just doesn't seem to allow its adherents all that much self-control, either on the metaphysical side, because after all, self-control implies autonomy or freedom, and how is that possible in a deterministic universe, or on the psychological side, because people like Marcus Aurelius don't seem to be particularly in control of themselves. Christianity, on the other hand, has always proclaimed, has always recognized that we humans indeed are not self-reliant, that we live and move and have our being in God, that what we depend upon utterly is divine grace, and that what we can do is out of free will make ourselves receptive to it, but what we cannot do is to somehow pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, as the Stoic believes is possible for human beings. Now, what all of this means is not that we ought to reject Stoicism or that we ought to consider it to be somehow old-fashioned and replaced by Christianity, because as I said at the beginning of these remarks, Stoicism seems to be making a comeback. But I think it's fair to say that the best way to think of Stoicism is to see it as a kind of therapy. Stoicism is a set of beliefs and a method which is in search of a way to enrich the meaning that a person has in his or her life, and to minimize or decrease anything that militates against a peaceful, calm, and self-assured existence. Let me just read you a couple of passages from Marcus Aurelius's wonderful, wonderful meditations, in which he sums up both the problem that Stoicism tries to be a therapy for, and the actual therapy. This is from the first book of his Meditations. Marcus writes, "Nothing is more wretched than the man who runs around in circles, busying himself with all kinds of things. An individual who can find no center of gravity, an individual who is constantly scattered. This person does not realize that it is enough to be concerned with the spirit within oneself and genuinely to serve it." There's the self-reliance. "This service consists in keeping it free from passions, aimlessness, and discontent with its fate at the hands of gods and men." That's the famous apatheia. So that's the problem. We need to somehow center ourselves, and this is the Stoic therapy. What then, Marcus writes, can help us on our way? One thing only: philosophy. This consists in guarding our inner spirit inviolate and unharmed, stronger than pleasures and pains, never acting aimlessly, falsely, or hypocritically, independent of the actions or inactions of others, accepting all that happens or is given as coming from whence one came oneself, that's the conformity with nature, and at all times awaiting death with contented mind as being only the release of the elements of which every creature is composed. The therapy that the Stoic offers for what we might call human alienation, human meaninglessness, is philosophical reason. And my friends, even though I have taught philosophy at the college level for 35 years, I am not as sanguine about the ability of philosophy and pure reason to assuage the hunger for transcendence as Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics apparently were. So Stoicism is a philosophy that we ought to take seriously and that we ought to celebrate, but I'm not at all sure that it is the end and the be-all which people like Marcus Aurelius believed it to be. I'm Father Kerry Walters, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment, this one celebrating the 1900th anniversary of the good Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Thank you so much. I'll see you next time.